We've been talking recently about optional but important kinds of auto insurance coverages. And last week we talked about uninsured motorist coverage. Join us again this week to talk about underinsured motorist coverage as attorney Tom Sinas of the Sinas Dramus Law Firm. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you again for having me.
Absolutely. So let's rewind just a little bit. Remind us again about the differences between mandatory and optional auto insurance coverage.
Right. So when we're talking about things like uninsured motorist coverage, underinsured motorist coverage, we're in the realm of optional coverages. That just means coverages that you don't have to buy in order to have a legal insurance policy. As we talked about last week, in order to legally drive, you have to have insurance, but really you only have to have insurance in the area of liability, certain forms of property damage, and no fault benefits, as we've talked about. But that doesn't mean that just because that's all you have to have, that that's the right choice, that that's enough. There are other forms of coverage that are optional. We talked last week about uninsured. We'll talk this week about underinsured. But another good example is collision and comprehensive coverage. Those are actually optional coverages. Now, many times people have, say, a car lease or a loan where they're required to have it, but they're not actually required by law. So there's this whole realm of auto insurance coverages that you're not required to have, but again, you oftentimes should have them.
Okay, so what is underinsured motorist coverage and how does it differ from uninsured motorist coverage?
Well, one way it doesn't differ is they almost sound the same, right?
Yeah.
You almost have to work to make yourself decipher that slight change in language, uninsured, underinsured. They almost sound so similar that I think people think they are the same. They are the same in that they're both optional, but they are very different in terms of when they apply. So last week we talked about uninsured motorist coverage. And I said a shorthand way of remembering that is it's coverage that you buy to protect you and your family from drivers who have no insurance. Okay, well then what about underinsured motorist coverage? Well, a similar shorthand way to remember that is coverage that you buy to protect you and your family from bad drivers with lousy insurance or minimal insurance. Again, the concept here is you purchasing insurance that would protect you in the event you're involved in an accident with someone else who has, in the case of uninsured motorist coverage, no insurance. In the case of underinsured motorist coverage, not a lot of insurance. So, of course, we don't know if and when that's going to happen. But one of the best things you can do is to buy underinsured motorist coverage, like uninsured motorist coverage, buy as much of it as you can afford, because of course you don't know when this is going to happen and you don't know who's going to cause a crash if you're in it. And you certainly don't know how much insurance they choose to purchase before the crash. And that's where underinsured motorist coverage comes into place. It is providing you and your family a way to access coverage beyond whatever liability coverage that at-fault driver had at the time of the crash.
Okay, so what should someone keep in mind if they're involved in an accident with an underinsured motorist?
Okay, let's just kind of give a hypothetical of how this situation might work. Let's use you and me again. Let's say we're involved in a crash and I'm responsible for the crash. Let's say I had only $100,000 in liability coverage, but you had $500,000 in underinsured motorist coverage. Well, you have a liability claim against me. If you have a certain type of serious injury, you have a claim against me, and you may be able to access my liability insurance for up to that $100,000 that I have. Well, what happens if your liability claim, if your damages exceed the value of $100,000? Well, that's when your underinsured motorist coverage steps in. Once you've exhausted my liability coverage as the at-fault driver, you turn to your own insurance company for the remainder of the coverage up to the value of your claim. So when it happens is that type of scenario. Somebody is involved in a crash caused by someone else. The victim is seriously hurt, but the careless driver doesn't have enough insurance that measures the victim's damages. So that's generally the scenario where it occurs. There are a series of very complicated rules that apply in underinsured motorist claims even different than uninsured motorist claims. There's this whole complicated issue of consent to settle, and it's a very technical one, but I think the takeaway here is that if you have one of these claims, they really have to be handled kind of very surgically, because there are rules that you have to follow, and those rules depend really largely on the language of your insurance policy. And if you've tried to read your auto insurance policy casually, you might know that it's not the easiest thing necessarily to decipher. So these underinsured motorist claims are notoriously tricky. They're important that people have access to the coverage, but accessing it requires that people follow a certain series of rules, and those rules can change depending upon who your auto insurance carrier is.
All right. Well, if they need help sorting this all out, who can they turn to?
Well, they can certainly give us a try. They can find us online at www.sinusdramus.com. They can shoot us an email at info@sinusdramus.com, or they can give us a call the old-fashioned way, West Michigan, 616-301-3333.
Great information. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.